Real estate usually fails quietly, but the projects in this video failed at scale, so large, so ambitious, and so disconnected from the demand that the buildings couldn't hide the mistake. Today's video is on 15 real estate projects that went too far. Number 15. The World Islands is a massive archipelago off the coast of Dubai. It was designed to resemble a map of the Earth when viewed from above. Announced in the early 2000s, the project was developed by Nakheel, the same government-backed developer behind the Palm Jumeirah. The concept was simple but extreme. Create hundreds of privately owned islands, each representing a country or a region, and sell them as ultra-exclusive real estate to wealthy people, corporations, and governments. The construction started in 2003, and it involved dredging roughly 300 million cubic meters of sand from the Persian Gulf seabed. The sand was then shaped into more than 260 individual islands separated by narrow channels and protected by a massive breakwater. The fundamental issue here was access. Unlike the Palm developments, the World Islands have no bridges connecting them to the mainland. Every island is reachable only by boat or helicopter. This dramatically increased construction costs, limits infrastructure options, and it complicates everyday living. Utilities like electricity, fresh water, sewage, and telecommunications would need to be custom-built for each island or cluster of islands, making development way more expensive than initially stated. Sales initially did appear strong. High-profile buyers reportedly purchased the islands for private estates, resorts, or themed developments. However, most buyers acquired raw land rather than completed property. Building on the islands has proved far more difficult than expected. The lack of shared infrastructure meant that each island required its own engineering solution, often at costs that exceed the value of the finished property. The global financial crisis of 2008 exposed those weaknesses. Credit tightened, speculative demand collapsed, and many buyers either abandoned their plans or defaulted on payments. Construction across the archipelago was largely stopped, and while the islands physically existed, they remained undeveloped. In the years since, various attempts have been made to revive parts of the World Islands. A number of small islands have been developed into private resorts or exclusive retreats, but the vast majority of the archipelago remains empty. Visible from above is a near-perfect map of the world with almost no signs of life. The project assumed that symbolic value would outweigh functional concerns, and that buyers would accept extraordinary costs and inconvenience in exchange for the novelty. In reality, real estate value depends on access, services, and long-term usability, factors that cannot be ignored, no matter how cool the concept is. Unlike unfinished buildings, the World Islands technically are complete. The land exists. What's missing is its purpose. 2 decades after its launch, it shows that real estate cannot rely on spectacle alone. When development prioritizes visual impact over livability, the result can be an entire world built without a population to inhabit it. Number 14. Forest City. This is a massive real estate development located in Johor, Malaysia, near the border with Singapore. It's marketed as a futuristic, environmentally friendly smart city. Planned to house hundreds of thousands of people, Forest City was built on reclaimed land and promoted as a global hub for international buyers. Instead, it became one of the most widely cited examples of large-scale real estate development that outpaced demand. Launched in the mid-2010s, Forest City was envisioned as a collection of artificial islands featuring high-rise residential towers, offices, hotels, and shopping centers. The scale was extraordinary. Entire districts were constructed simultaneously. Marketing focused heavily on foreign buyers, particularly from China, attracted by the relatively low prices and proximity to Singapore. Construction advanced pretty quickly. Roads, utilities, and hundreds of apartment blocks were completed in a very short period of time. However, the sales didn't keep pace with supply. At the same time, Malaysia introduced policies restricting foreign property ownership in certain segments, and changes in Chinese capital controls the limited availability of overseas buyers to move money, further reducing the pool of potential residents. As a result, huge portions of the city remain unoccupied. Completed towers are stood largely empty, with dark windows and minimal activity, and while some residents and businesses did move in, occupancy levels are far below the original projections. From a real estate perspective, though, Forest City shows the risks of building at maximum scale before confirming your demand. The project relied on optimistic assumptions about international investment flow, regulatory stability, and buyer behavior. When those assumptions changed, the physical reality of the development could not easily adapt. Now, importantly, it's not abandoned. Development continues in a modified form, and efforts are underway to attract new residents, including incentives for domestic buyers and new economic uses. However, the initial phase is a reminder of how quickly large-scale real estate can just overshoot the market. As a case study, Forest City shows how modern real estate excess doesn't always end in collapse. Sometimes it ends in silence, rows of unfinished buildings waiting for a population that was expected but never arrived. Number 13. Ponte City. It's a 54-story residential tower located in the Berea district of Johannesburg, South Africa. Completed in 1975, it was originally designed as a high-end apartment building for affluent residents. Its cylindrical shape, hollow core, and panoramic city views made it a landmark almost immediately. However, over the following decades, it became one of the most extreme examples of a real estate project that expanded beyond the social and economic realities surrounding it. At the time of its construction, Ponte City was the tallest residential building in Africa. The design featured a central open shaft intended to bring light and air into the interior apartments. Early residents were drawn by the modern amenities, the strong security, and proximity to the city center. This project reflected optimism about urban growth. That optimism, though, proved fragile. During the 1980s and 90s, Johannesburg underwent significant social and economic change. As apartheid ended and urban demographics shifted, many wealthier residents moved to the suburban areas. Inner-city property values declined, and maintenance across large residential buildings became difficult to sustain. With hundreds of units stacked vertically, the building required constant maintenance, security, and management. As occupancy patterns changed, rental income declined, services deteriorated, elevators failed, utilities became unreliable, and waste management systems were overwhelmed. The central core, once a design feature, started to fill with debris over time as building management collapsed. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, it had become associated with extreme overcrowding and unsafe living conditions. Some apartments were illegally subdivided, and basic services were frequently disrupted. At its lowest point, the building's interior was reportedly filled with trash rising several stories high in the central shaft, though later cleanups addressed this issue. Importantly, it was never abandoned. People continued to live there, often because it was one of the few affordable housing options available in the city center. In the late 2000s, redevelopment began. New owners invested in restoring the basic services, improving security, and stabilizing the occupancy. And while those efforts have achieved partial success, the large-scale redevelopment plans were repeatedly delayed or scaled back. Today, it is functioning but heavily transformed. Its story is not one of total collapse, but of overreach followed by adaptation. As a real estate project, it shows how scale can magnify risk, and how developments that ignore long-term management realities can quickly become ungovernable. Ponte City may have been a real estate venture that went too far. Ambition is not the only problem. Ignoring social, economic, and operational limits is. Number 12. Oceanwide Plaza sits directly across from the Crypto.com arena in downtown Los Angeles, occupying one of the most visible and valuable parcels of real estate in the city. Conceived in the mid-2010s, the project was planned as a mixed-use complex of 3 glass towers rising more than 40 stories, combined with luxury condominiums, a hotel, real estate space, and entertainment venues. With an estimated cost exceeding $1 billion, Oceanwide Plaza was designed to signal Los Angeles' arrival as a true high-density global city. Construction began in 2015. Early progress was rapid. The concrete frames of all 3 towers rose up quickly, which reshaped the downtown skyline. And from the outside, the project appeared to be on track, benefiting from a booming real estate market and a strong demand for luxury housing in LA. Behind the scenes, however, the project relied on international financing and optimistic assumptions about continued capital flow from China. As Chinese authorities tightened controls on overseas investment and lending conditions changed, Oceanwide's access to funding deteriorated. By 2019, construction slowed down, and by early 2020, work had stopped. The towers were already structurally complete, with exposed concrete floors, open elevator shafts, and unfinished facades. For years, the structures remained untouched, protected only by fencing and minimal security. As time passed, the consequences of this overreach became visible. Graffiti artists accessed the upper floors, covering entire facades with large-scale murals that could be seen across downtown. And while some viewed the artwork as urban expression, city officials and property owners saw it as a symbol of neglect and failure. The building also raised some safety concerns, as unfinished high-rise structures are expensive to secure and difficult to maintain without active construction. But the project's problems weren't purely aesthetic. Property taxes, debt obligations, and legal disputes accumulated while the site generated no income. Any new developer would need massive capital, updated permits, and revised designs to reflect the post-pandemic market reality. In a city grappling with housing shortages, homelessness, and rising construction, the stalled project became a lightning rod for criticism. It embodied a paradox of contemporary real estate: extreme abundance of built space that no one can use. Oceanwide Plaza is compelling because it's not ancient, remote, or abstract. It's modern, highly visible, and unfinished in plain sight. It's proof that even in the heart of a major city, ambition can outrun reality. Number 11. Kilamba New City. This is a massive planned urban development located about 30 kilometers outside Luanda, Angola's capital. Built with Chinese financing and construction firms, the project was designed to house hundreds of thousands of residents in a fully planned environment of apartment blocks, schools, and shopping centers. When it was unveiled in the early 2010s, Kilamba was promoted as a solution to Luanda's severe housing shortage. Instead, it became an international symbol of real estate development that overshot its market. Construction began in 2008 and it progressed. Dozens of near-identical high-rise residential buildings were erected, accompanied by supporting infrastructure like roads and utilities. And from a technical standpoint, the city was functional. Buildings were completed, streets were paved, and services were installed. The scale was extraordinary, resembling a fully formed urban district rather than a phased development. The core problem emerged immediately after completion: pricing. Apartments here were priced way beyond what most Angolans could afford. The development targeted a middle class that, at the time, was extremely small. Financing options were limited, wages were low, and mortgage systems were underdeveloped. Images of vacant streets and unoccupied towers circulated around the world, often labeled as a ghost city. And while this label did oversimplify the situation, it reflected a real mismatch between supply and demand. The city existed physically, but not economically. Real estate had been delivered without a viable population to sustain it. The reasons for this were structural. Kilamba was financed through oil-backed loans and built rapidly during a period of high commodity prices. The development assumed continued economic growth and rising income. When the oil prices fell and Angola's economy slowed, those assumptions collapsed. Unlike speculative developments that fail before construction, Kilamba went too far by completing everything at once. There was no opportunity to pause, scale back, or adjust pricing gradually. Thousands of apartments were delivered into a market that could absorb only a fraction of them. Over time, the situation partially improved. The Angolan government intervened by lowering prices and offering subsidized financing. Occupancy did increase and parts of the city became functional residential areas. However, that recovery required substantial policy intervention and financial restructuring. People live there today. Kilamba New City is not a failure in the sense of abandonment, but as a real estate project, it's a great example of ambition outpacing socioeconomic reality. Real estate is not just about buildings, it's about income, financing, and long-term affordability. Kilamba went too far by building a city before building the conditions necessary for that city to exist. It's a great reminder that development can't substitute for economic structure, no matter how complete the infrastructure appears. Number 10. Ocean Flower Island. It's a massive artificial island development located off the coast of Danzhou in Hainan Province in China. Developed by the China Evergrande Group, it was a project that was promoted as the world's largest man-made island, and it was one of the most ambitious real estate developments ever attempted. Announced in the mid-2010s, it was envisioned as a luxury tourism and residential destination featuring resorts, museums, and theme parks, commercial districts, and tens of thousands of apartments. Construction began around 2015, and it moved at an extraordinary speed. Entire districts were built simultaneously, supported by extensive land reclamation, seawalls, and bridges. Evergrande invested heavily, and by some estimates, total planned spending exceeded $160 billion across all the phases. Though the project went too far in several ways at once. First was the scale. Oceanflower Island was not phased conservatively. Massive amounts of housing and commercial space were delivered long before the demand was proven. Second was the location. While Hainan is designated as a special economic zone and tourist destination, Danshou itself was not an established hub, limiting the organic demand for luxury real estate. Chinese regulators later stated that parts of the island were built illegally on protected marine areas and that reclamation had damaged coral reefs and coastal ecosystems. In 2021, authorities ordered the demolition of dozens of residential buildings on the island, citing the environmental violations. At the same time, there was a broader financial crisis for Evergrande. The developer became the most prominent example of China's over-leveraged real estate sector, carrying hundreds of billions of dollars in liabilities. Despite heavy marketing, the occupancy rates were way below initial projections. Tourism infrastructure existed largely without tourists, and residential units existed without a population. The project became increasingly difficult to sustain. It was designed to showcase national ambition and developer power, but it assumed that capital, regulatory tolerance, and demand would always remain aligned. It succeeded in building at an extraordinary speed, but the failure came afterwards, when the physical reality of the development outpaced economic, environmental, and regulatory limits. The long-term future of the site is uncertain, but what is clear is that Oceanflower Island crossed a line where scale itself became the risk. Number 9. Sesea. It's a large residential development located about 40 kilometers south of Madrid in Spain. It's often referred to as Residencial Francisco Hernando. The project became one of the most famous symbols of Spain's housing bubble in the mid-2000s. It was planned as a city-scale housing development with more than 13,000 apartments. Sesea was built on the assumption that Spain's growth and easy credit conditions would continue indefinitely. Construction began in the early 2000s during a period of intense real estate speculation across Spain. Housing demands appeared endless, mortgages were widely available, and large developments were approved quickly. The project went too far by building almost everything at once. Thousands of apartments were completed before the infrastructure, employment centers, or even public services were established. Retail areas, schools, and transport links lagged behind the residential construction, and the development assumed that residents would arrive automatically once the homes were available. That assumption collapsed in 2008. The housing bubble burst alongside the global financial crisis. The credit tightened, unemployment rose, and housing demand evaporated. Thousands of completed apartments in Sesea remained unsold. The streets were empty, the storefronts never opened, and large sections of the development had no permanent residents. Because so much inventory existed in one place, prices fell. Maintenance of shared infrastructure became difficult with so few people contributing to the costs. The development quickly gained international attention as a ghost city, though the term did obscure the fact that the buildings were structurally complete and legally occupied by some people. Over time, partial recovery happened. As housing prices dropped significantly, some buyers moved in. Occupancy increased gradually, but the city never reached the population levels originally planned. Sesea's failure wasn't rooted in illegal construction or poor building quality. It went too far by assuming that market growth would continue uninterrupted, and that scale itself would create demand. Sesea shows how excess can emerge quietly through permits and mortgages rather than through spectacle. Nothing about the buildings themselves was radical. What was radical was the decision to deliver a city before a population existed to sustain it. It's not abandoned, but it is a physical record of what happens when real estate development outruns economic reality. The streets are real, the buildings are real, but the limits they expose to are real too. Number 8. The Kangbashi District. Kangbashi is a master-planned urban district in Ordo, Inner Mongolia, in China. It was conceived in the early 2000s. It was designed to become a modern administrative and cultural center capable of housing more than 1 million people. Wide boulevards, monumental civic buildings, residential towers, museums, and public plazas were all constructed in a very short period of time. At its peak, Kangbashi became one of the most cited examples of a project that expanded far beyond demand. The development was fueled by Ordo's sudden wealth from coal and natural gas extraction. Local government revenues surged, and planners moved quickly to convert resource income into permanent urban infrastructure. From a construction standpoint, the project did succeed. Roads were laid, utilities installed, and thousands of apartments completed. The cultural institutions like libraries, museums, and theaters were finished and operational. The issue wasn't whether the city could function, but whether anyone needed it at the scale provided. Demand failed to materialize. Housing prices were high relative to local incomes, and they lacked the employment base necessary to attract large numbers of long-term residents. Occupancy rates remained extremely low in the years following the completion, giving rise to the widely used but often oversimplified label of a ghost city. This project went too far by assuming that resource wealth would automatically translate into sustained urban growth. Coal revenues were volatile, and when prices fell, so did the economic justification for large-scale migration. Importantly, though, Kangbashi was never abandoned. Government offices operated, some residents lived there, and services functioned. Over time, occupancy increased modestly as the prices adjusted. However, population levels are far below the original projections. The buildings are intact, the roads are paved, and the city exists. What was missing was organic demand. The project treated urbanization as something that could be scheduled and constructed in advance, rather than something that emerges gradually from jobs, migration, and affordability. Kangbashi shows how excess does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like silence, empty streets, unused apartments, and infrastructure waiting for a future that was planned, but never economically secured. Moving on to number 7. Palm Jebel Ali. It's one of Dubai's large artificial island projects, and it was conceived as a sister development to the Palm Jumeirah. It was announced in the early 2000s and developed by Nakheel. This project was planned to be significantly larger than Palm Jumeirah. At its full build-out, it was intended to house hundreds of thousands of residents and visitors. Construction began with land reclamations, and by the mid-2000s, the palm-shaped outline of Palm Jebel Ali was clearly visible. The massive amounts of sand were dredged and shaped, and breakwaters were constructed to protect the island from wave action. The project went too far when development continued despite clear warning signs. Unlike Palm Jumeirah, which benefited from strong early demand and phased occupation, Palm Jebel Ali advanced largely on speculative assumptions. Infrastructure and plots were prepared before confirming buyers or tenants were secured at scale. Then the financial crisis in 2008 halted the progress abruptly. Property demand collapsed, credit tightened, and work stopped. While the land existed, there were few completed buildings and no established communities. The island remained largely undeveloped for years, exposed to erosion, maintenance cost, and changing priorities. Unlike abandoned construction sites, this one presented a different problem: a finished landmass without a clear purpose. Roads, utilities, and buildings couldn't simply be added incrementally without renewed investment on a huge scale. Restarting development required reassessing the market demand and redesigning plans. Over time, they've been reevaluated and redevelopment plans have been announced in revised forms. However, the project's long dormancy cemented its reputation as an example of expansion that exceeded realistic timelines and demand. This project assumed that success could be replicated simply by building bigger without accounting for timing and economic cycles. As a real estate case study, this one shows that even in markets known for rapid growth, momentum can disappear suddenly. When real estate development races ahead of demand, the resulting gap can take decades to close. Number 6. Ciudad Real Central Airport. It's located in Castilla-La Mancha. It's a sparsely populated region of central Spain. Conceived during the height of Spain's mid-2000s real estate boom, the airport was promoted as a private alternative to Madrid's congested aviation system. It was designed to handle millions of passengers per year and accommodate long-haul aircraft. Instead, it became one of the clearest examples of real estate development going far beyond any realistic demand. Planning began in the early 2000s, driven by optimistic projections of regional growth and air travel demand. Developers envisioned an airport as a catalyst for surrounding development. The project received approvals and financing at a time when credit was abundant and risk was often underestimated. Construction moved forward rapidly. A long runway, modern terminal building, parking facilities, and rail connections were all completed. The total investment exceeded €1 billion, and from a technical standpoint, it was functional and met international standards. The problem was location. Ciudad Real sits far from major population centers, and it lacks the business or tourism demand required to sustain a huge airport. When it opened in 2008, the airlines showed little interest. Passenger numbers were extremely low from the outset. Then the global financial crisis hit shortly after, collapsing Spain's property market and drying up the airline expansion plans. The airport declared bankruptcy in 2012, and for years it sat largely unused. Attempts to sell the facility were complicated by debt and legal disputes. At various points, the airport was offered for sale at a fraction of its construction cost. Ciudad Real went too far by assuming infrastructure could create demand rather than respond to it. The airport was first built, with surrounding development expected to follow, and when the real estate boom ended, there was no underlying economic activity to support it. As a real estate-driven project, Ciudad Real Central Airport is a textbook example of speculative excess. It clearly shows how these large developments can be technically successful, yet economically unviable when the timing is misjudged. Number 5. Dubailand. This is a massive mixed-use development area in Dubai, announced in 2003 as one of the largest entertainment-focused real estate projects ever proposed. Envisioned as a city-scale destination combining theme parks, resorts, residential communities, retail districts, and cultural attractions, Dubailand was intended to rival global entertainment hubs, while also anchoring a huge surrounding real estate development. The master plan covered hundreds of square kilometers and included dozens of sub-projects developed by different entities. At its peak, Dubailand represented one of the most ambitious real estate expansions Dubai had ever attempted. The project went too far in scope and sequencing. Rather than developing a single anchor attraction and expanding gradually, multiple components were launched simultaneously. Infrastructure was extended deep into undeveloped desert areas, and large residential plots were planned on the assumption that entertainment demand would scale. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, many sub-projects stalled or were canceled. Financing evaporated, developers withdrew, and timelines were indefinitely extended. Some attractions did open years later in modified form, while others never progressed beyond the initial groundwork. The problem was systemic. The master plan depended on continuous growth from tourism, population, and investor appetite. When those factors slowed, the scale of land committed to entertainment-driven real estate became difficult to justify. Some residential communities were completed independently of the original entertainment vision. A few major attractions eventually opened under revised plans. However, the unified concept of a theme park city was never realized as originally envisioned. As a case study, Dubailand is less about collapse and more about dilution. The development exists, but not in the form that justified the original scale. It shows that even in fast-growing markets, ambition has to be paced by demand and economic durability, rather than momentum alone. Number 4. The Burj Khalifa Lake District. Downtown Dubai is anchored by the Burj Khalifa and its surrounding Lake District. It's one of the most ambitious mixed-use real estate developments ever completed. It was conceived in the early 2000s by Emaar Properties. The project was designed to create a new urban core from scratch, combining luxury residential towers, hotels, retail, offices, and public space at an unprecedented density and cost. And while downtown Dubai is functional and globally recognized, it does also represent a point where real estate ambition stretched infrastructure and long-term sustainability to their limits. The development required a massive upfront investment. Artificial lakes were constructed, extensive underground parking was built, and entire road networks were redesigned to handle anticipated traffic volume. The assumption was that international capital and tourism would continue to expand indefinitely. For several years, this did appear to work. Units sold rapidly during the pre-2008 boom, and downtown Dubai became a symbol of globalized luxury real estate. However, that financial crisis exposed the fragility of this model. Property values fell sharply, speculative buyers exited, and many units were left vacant or entered distress. Rents dropped, and resale liquidity declined. Enormous amounts of value were placed into a tightly packed district that depended heavily on tourism and luxury consumption. Infrastructure costs are exceptionally high, maintenance is continuous, and the area remains sensitive to global economies. Affordability was another issue. Downtown Dubai is largely inaccessible to middle-income residents. It limits organic and long-term population growth. And while the district functions as a destination, it operates less like a traditional city neighborhood and more like a curated environment that has to be constantly managed and subsidized through activity. Downtown Dubai shows how real estate can succeed operationally while still being pushed beyond sustainable balance. It's not empty, it's not abandoned or even unfinished, but it represents a ceiling on how far density and spectacle and cost can be stacked before flexibility is lost. Once built at this scale, adjustment is extremely difficult. Number 3. Lehman Brothers Tower. The Heron Tower site in London's financial district offers a less obvious but highly instructive example of real estate going too far. Originally tied to Lehman Brothers as a major tenant before the 2008 financial crisis, the project was planned as a flagship office tower aligned with peak global financial expansion. The collapse of Lehman Brothers fundamentally altered the project's trajectory and exposed how tightly large-scale real estate can become bound to speculative cycles. Planning and early construction took place during a period of intense growth in London's real estate market. Office demand from financial institutions appeared insatiable, and developers raced to deliver premium space at unprecedented scale and cost. This tower's design emphasized visibility and technological sophistication, features justified only by continued expansion in the financial sector. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, the logic behind the project unraveled. Financing tightened, anchor tenancy disappeared, and demand projections collapsed. Construction was delayed and then restructured, and while the tower was eventually completed and re-tenanted under different conditions, the project required design, refinancing, and delay to even survive. This example shows how real estate can go too far by tying physical development too closely to a single economic narrative. The Heron Tower's story matters because it shows that going too far doesn't require empty buildings or ghost cities. Sometimes it appears as vulnerability, projects that survive only because markets recover or ownership changes. In high-finance districts, especially real estate, often reflects confidence at peak rather than resilience across a cycle. When that confidence breaks, the buildings remain, but the economics behind them has to be rebuilt almost from scratch. When capital, confidence, and construction move in lockstep, a single shock can freeze projects that were designed to symbolize permanence. Number 2. King Abdullah Economic City. The King Abdullah Economic City is one of the largest planned urban developments ever attempted in the Middle East. It's located on Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast, roughly 100 kilometers north of Jeddah. The project was announced in 2005 as part of a broader effort to diversify Saudi economy beyond oil. From the outset, it wasn't conceived as a gradual expansion. It was designed as a complete city delivered at scale. This kind of approach marked a huge departure from traditional development, where cities grow incrementally in response to economic pressure. This one attempted to pre-build the conditions for growth, assuming that the infrastructure and scale would attract residents, businesses, and foreign investment organically. Early momentum was strong. The project was developed by Emaar, the Economic City, a publicly listed company backed by Saudi and regional investors. Billions of dollars were committed to the core infrastructure. The King Abdullah Port, one of the largest privately operated ports in the region, was built to serve as a major logistics and trade hub. On paper, the city had all the components required to succeed. It offered modern housing, proximity to the Red Sea, a dedicated high-speed rail connection to Jeddah and Mecca, and the industrial land positioned to benefit from global trade routes. However, as years passed, the gap emerged between physical construction and actual occupancy. While parts of the city became operational, the population remained way below projections. Commercial areas struggled to achieve any critical mass, and many businesses hesitated to relocate operations away from established cities. One of the central challenges was the demand. Building a city from scratch requires not only housing, but jobs, social networks, and cultural gravity. Job creation was slower and more specialized than expected, which limited the pool of potential residents. Affordability, of course, also played a role. They were often out of reach for lower-income workers, while higher-income professionals frequently preferred established urban centers. Another constraint was geography. The coastal location offered logistical advantages. It also placed the city at a distance from Saudi Arabia's main population center. Daily commuting was impractical for most people, and relocating entire households required strong incentives that proved difficult to sustain. But unlike speculative developments, this one didn't fail structurally. Infrastructure functions, the port operates, residents live there, but the project went too far in scale relative to demand. The city was designed for millions before thousands had arrived. That imbalance created a long-term challenge in service and economic viability. Today, the King Abdullah Economic City is a partially realized vision. It's neither a ghost city nor a thriving metropolis. The roads, buildings, and infrastructure show a future that was planned in advance, but is yet to arrive at the scale envisioned. It shows that cities are not products that can be delivered fully formed. They're systems that depend on time, labor markets, social cohesion, and economies. When scales run ahead of those forces, even well-financed and well-engineered projects will stall in place. Number 1. The New South China Mall. The New South China Mall, located in Dongguan, Guangdong Province in China, is one of the most extreme examples of a real estate project that went too far. When it opened in 2005, it was the largest shopping mall in the world by gross leasable area, covering more than 650,000 square meters. At the time of its opening, China's economy was expanding, and confidence in consumer growth was extremely high. Developers assumed that rising incomes, urbanization, and population growth would naturally translate into demand for these mega-scale retail environments. Dongguan, positioned between Guangzhou and Shenzhen, was viewed strategically as located within one of China's fastest-growing regions. The scale of this project was unprecedented. Entire city blocks were enclosed under one roof. Themed districts recreated Parisian boulevards, Venetian canals, and Dutch townscapes. The mall was designed to attract international brands, tourists, and local shoppers alike. From a construction perspective, it was technically a success. The structure was completed largely as planned and systems functioned. What went wrong was demand. Despite its size and spectacle, the New South China Mall opened with extremely low occupancy. Reports from the late 2000s indicated that fewer than 10% of retail units were leased in the years following opening. Large sections of it were just empty. Escalators ran without passengers and entire corridors were unused. The core issue here was location and timing. Dongguan, while a major manufacturing hub, didn't have a large consumer population with disposable income necessary to support this retail at scale. At the same time, China's retail ecosystem was still evolving. Traditional shopping districts, street markets, and smaller malls remained dominant, while e-commerce was beginning its rapid rise. The belief was that building the largest mall would automatically draw retailers and shoppers. In practice, retail requires consistent foot traffic before committing to long-term leases, and shoppers require a critical mass of stores before visiting regularly. The mall failed to reach either of those thresholds. And of course, operating costs compounded the problem. Maintaining such a huge infrastructure required significant ongoing expenditure on security, utilities, cleaning, and repairs. Over time, parts of the mall fell into visible disuse, which reinforced its reputation as a failed project. Now, unlike projects halted mid-construction, the New South China Mall's failure was fully visible. The building existed, the space was there, but what was missing was economic purpose, and this made the project especially striking as it illustrated that completion does not guarantee success. In later years, redevelopment efforts were attempted. Portions of the mall were rebranded, converted to entertainment use, or repurposed for offices and leisure facilities. The scale, though, remained vastly disproportionate to the realistic demand. As a real estate project, it's a warning about extrapolation. Developers projected recent growth trends far into the future and built accordingly. When growth slowed or shifted direction, the physical reality of the mall could not adapt quickly enough. The mall's still there. Its existence is a reminder that real estate excess does not always end in collapse. Sometimes it ends in permanence, large, costly structures that cannot be undone easily and must be lived with for decades. This project went too far. The New South China Mall represents the purest form of overreach, not because it was unfinished, illegal, or poorly built, but because it was completed exactly as planned and revealed that the plan itself was fundamentally detached from demand.